With the introduction of the SMB2 mushroom and Mario Maker's 2 update, that led me to thinking, could you remake the entire game in Super Mario Maker 2? I mean, with the power-up you can stand on most enemies, pick them up to throw them, and even super jump from crouching, so the original controls are pretty spot on. Well, that's what I've spent the last week doing, recreating all 20 levels to the best of my abilities. I even put them all in a world, so feel free to check them out if you'd like, but I wanted to show you how I tried to remake the levels in the immense struggles and difficulty I had doing so. Now, immediately, 1-1 cannot be 100% replicated. That's because you can't set the first sub-area to be vertically based. I'm forced to go down a pipe, so I make quick do of that. And you know what I realized from this? I think that Mario Bros. 2 is still the only Mario game where the first level starts as being vertically based. But anyway, I wasn't able to tell how far Mario needed to fall, so I downloaded the map and went into Photoshop. I started copy and pasting the clouds because they could be used as a unit of measurement, and after lots of copies, I found that from the door to the ground, it took 19 clouds. I had to do this for almost every level, because sometimes it was really hard to tell what the spacing was. But that was the least of my problems. Next, I had to figure out the turnips. Is this something you could even do? Well, kind of. I started with adding coins in their spots, which was an okay idea, but it left a hole in the ground. Then I tried buzzy beetles, which felt more like grabbing a turnip, but again, there was a hole in the ground. I decided to resort to solid ground with clouds that you can grab. You don't get anything out of the clouds, but there really wasn't anything else I could do. Snowballs was also an option, but that would mean every stage would have to be snow themed, which doesn't seem like the best idea. Now, I did watch a video of someone else recreating 1-1 in Mario Bros. 2, and their idea was to put the turnip items on a track that move up and down. While I think this is a very novel concept, it seemed a bit weird to make the turnips only grabbable at certain times. And there's really not a right or wrong answer to this, but I stuck with using clouds. The next line of order was making the Shy Guys. I decided to use Koopa Troopas because their properties are very similar. The red Shy Guys fall off platforms like the green Koopas, and the pink Shy Guys stay on platforms like the red Koopas. Now yes, there is a shell turnip and Shy Guys don't have shells, but I have very limited options to work with, and this seemed like the best choice. In terms of including the subspace world, where you throw the potions, well, there's not really any way to recreate that. There's just not enough doors to be able to switch course themes, and on top of that, doors were static in Mario Maker 2. So instead, I opted to add all the mushrooms and invisible blocks for people to grab. Some of them you're not going to be able to get, others you can if you've played a lot of SMB2 and already know where they spawn. The semi-solids I was able to mostly replicate, but there were a few that were 2 units in length. This was an issue because the smallest you can make for semi-solids in Mario Maker 2 is 3 units, so those can't be recreated perfectly. Now you've probably also noticed the flying Goombas. Those are replaced with the Tweeter enemy. They both move and jump a little bit, so I figured these would be fine substitutes. I also replaced all the cherries with coins, so while you can't spawn in a star after getting 5 coins, I can still grab them at least. Another issue with replicating Mario Bros. 2 levels is losing the playstyle when getting hit, so I made sure that most pipes spawn mushrooms for easy access. As for the logs, there's no way to create lift generators that respawn and move in one direction, so I just have them go up and down. Now, remaking Ninjas was extremely hard to figure out. At first, I used flying rocky wrenches. That's because they moved up and down like Ninjas, but they also threw their wrench projectiles. So I put a Goomba on a track and used that instead. I felt like this made more sense as a Ninja than as turnips, but again, there is no right or wrong answer. Now for the secret door in the cave, I simply ran out of room, but I wanted to add a 50 coin in that same location so people would have some incentive to check it out. Bob-ombs will be the one exception to putting holes in the ground, so you can actually get through this in the most authentic way possible by having to time your throw. Next was Hoopster, and at first I didn't think there was a way to replicate this, but I discovered that you can pair a track, vine, and then a buzzy beetle. The effect works surprisingly well. Creating the vertical part of the stage was tricky because I had to keep adding doors or warp pipes to add to the vertical section. Now perhaps this could have been optimized a little better, but it's what I went with. For making the clouds, I just used the donut block so it looked different. The hardest part of all this though was making Birdo. Adding a sound effect to play the boss music was simple enough, but figuring out how to create the same attack pattern was really tricky. I knew that no matter what, I needed to stack a cannon on an enemy, because you could pick those cannonballs up and throw them just like the eggs. But which character to use that for was where I was having issues. I tried Bowser, but he was way too difficult. Hammer Bros just didn't seem right. Boom Boom, you could just step on him and he was dead, but that's assuming you got hit and are using normal Mario instead. And then there was Bowser Jr. He requires 3 hits to go down, and you basically have to hit him with cannons. It's much harder to just jump on him. But then there's the problem of him spitting fire, and he's just way too difficult for a beginner boss. So even though Boom Boom only takes 1 hit to go down, I figured I would save the Bowser Jr. boss for when Birdo actually does spit fire later in the game. I talked to Mabro about this for ideas, and she came up with this insane contraption with a cannon, track, ice block, and spinies. And while this is an extremely creative boss, it didn't really look or play like a Birdo fight. As someone that doesn't really make Mario Maker levels, 1-1 was very tough. But now that I figured out a lot of the assets, making levels was going a little bit faster. 1-2, however, adds a new enemy, Pidgeot, and I figured using Lekatu would be a perfect replacement. Well, for the most part. The cloud lasts way longer than Pidgeot's carpet, so I had to add a spike barrier so you couldn't cheese the level. The Bezos are a different story. There's not really an enemy like them besides bullet bills, and you can't spawn those off screen without a launcher, so I went with a flying Buzzy Beetle, which is kind of the same thing. You can jump on the beetles and they fly in a straightish path, so I suppose that does the trick. Next, you'll notice these doors. These are ways into the pot levels, which I put those somewhere else on this screen. The second pot is where you usually go to unlock the key door, but then I ran into a problem. Using a door doesn't take you to the second sub area. I was gonna have to use a pipe for that, so I added the pipe and some on and off blocks and put those in the pot area. But not having a key at all just didn't feel right, so I decided to still add the curse key, and it's now labeled as a hard mode for those that want some extra challenge. For every level with Phanto, there will now be an option to hit the on/off block or get a regular key, with a curse key right next to it for an optional challenge. Now that I was underground, I needed to replicate the snippets, and Spike was the best option. You may notice that I didn't add bob-ohms in every single spot like the game has, and through some beta testing, it wasn't really necessary, and some bob-ohm placements made the level a lot less fun. While not perfectly authentic, it made sense for this remake. At the end of the room, I made sure the platform was tall enough so you had to super jump since that's what Mario normally had to do, or you could use a Goomba for assistance. Moving on to 1-3, I was having so much trouble replicating Trouter. They were very hard to imitate. I initially tried using Cheep Cheeps, but their movement was completely different. Then I tried using Piranha Plants and flying Rocky Wrenches, which was more accurate, but also not really, and it also added the pipes, which just makes the whole thing look clunky. So I asked Mabro about this, and she came up with a genius idea. You start by taking a hard block, then stack a bob-omb and chain chomp underneath it. Then you make a track with the top side open and attach it to the hard block. Make another track, attach that to the bottom, then add a flying muncher, and you have yourself a Trouter. The bob-omb blows up the chain chomp and block, leaving you with a muncher that has a wooden peg on top of it that goes up and down. This is about as close as I imagine we'll ever get to replicating Trouter. You may have noticed that this pipe is missing due to a lack of doors that I can use, so I added an invisible block in the mushroom to make up for it. And besides, it's really just used to warp to World 4, and I really wish we could add warps because that would have been really cool. For the mushroom blocks, I decided to use springs, but the Koopa kept bouncing off them and getting launched down, so I had to replace one of the springs with a block instead. I also replaced Spark with sped up Spike Tops, which besides their slower speed is almost the same kind of enemy. I also wanted to create the crystal ball, but I couldn't really find anything to use, so I just put a cloud there instead. And yes, I'm gonna use the cloud for multiple different things to make the levels more authentic. Then for Mauser, I originally used a Mecha Koopa and a cannon with the bob-ohms attached, and I mean that kinda worked and he moved a little bit like Mauser, but the boss was way too easy. So with some help from Mayro, we found a better solution. Using a giant boom boom, a bob-omb cannon will slowly spit out bob-ohms, which I have to very carefully slide down this opening. Both of these boss ideas really aren't that authentic to Mauser, but it's the best thing we came up with. Man, and that was just World 1. I was getting used to scaling levels at this point, and the only challenge now is just recreating any new enemies that show up. As an example, 2-1 has enemies called Cobrats. I wanted to use something different from Koopas, so I decided I'd use dry bones. I really had no way of recreating these bone textures as well, so I just used basic blocks instead. I know it looks dumb, but again, I have very little assets to work with. There's also these platforms that you can pass through in the original game, so I figured I'd use donut blocks for these. Now for 1-3, I could have technically done the same thing with the caves and made those blocks donut blocks since you can pass through them, but they also fall if you stand on them for too long, so I really only want to use the donut platforms when necessary. Next was making the Panzer, and the best solution was a Hammer Bro. There is no Fire Bro in this game for some bizarre reason, so this was the best alternative. And I didn't have a way of making quicksand, but making the digging part was really fun, because I could actually replicate it perfectly. I love that you can do this with clouds. There's gonna be a lot of levels like this, I can already tell. I could have made this the underground theme for the correct music, but I felt the desert just looked a lot nicer and slightly more accurate. And that's the thing with recreating these levels, there is a lot of give and take with these things. 2-2 was a crippling one to make. Every pot in the original game lets you go down it into the bonus room, but I obviously can't do that for several pots. The first pot I replaced as a door so you can access it, but the other pots I just had to make into ice blocks since there were no other assets I could use. What's funny about adding the Pokey is that the sprite already looks like the one from Mario Bros. 2, even though this is the Mario Bros. 1 engine. Since 2-2 introduces the red Birdo, it was time to start using the Bowser Jr. and Cannon combo, which makes the fights much harder. I did use springs as the mushroom blocks again, but unfortunately they don't hurt Birdo. 2-3's beginning vine needed to be split up, which looks a little awkward, but there wasn't much of a workaround. And honestly, I had to do things like this for a lot of the levels. Moving on to the underground segment, I had to cut this a little short. Normally after passing the orb, you go down this long hallway and go inside the mouth, but since I had to make this in the vertical sub area, I didn't want to make another door just to go down that hallway, so cutting that out seemed more practical. Tryclyde was a lot easier to replicate than I expected. Since he's usually stationary, I just added some springs to make sure that he stays in that general area. I couldn't use the springs as mushroom blocks, so I opted with cannonballs that launch up as a replacement. Larry shoots lasers in a very similar pattern to Tryclyde, so this seemed like the best combo. Going into 3-1, I decided to use the sky theme since most of the level is in the sky. The blocks don't look the same, but I figured a change of pace is a good idea. Recreating the clouds with the donuts was really time consuming since I had to make sure to get all these alignments correct. With 3-1, I was able to keep the secret door that's at the bottom of the waterfall. Normally going through that door takes you through a warp if you use the potion in the right place, but since we can't warp and I don't want to soft lock anyone, I instead added a pipe that allows you to bypass the cloud climbing section. I was also able to add the hidden door, which is a bit of a shortcut to Birdo. I made sure to make it pretty hard to reach, and it requires a precise jump with the springs. Also, throwing the springs at the Hammer Bros is a lot more fun than I thought it would be. Now, normally 3-2 has you going back and forth between the sub area multiple times, and honestly, I never found that fun in the original game. So instead, I put the top and bottom layers of 3-2 onto one screen with a few sacrifices. By adding a little extra stage to the beginning and end, I was able to mostly recreate the stage. For the yellow dirt, I've been using blocks, but since there's a top and bottom portion displayed at the same time, I opted with question mark blocks just to differentiate them a little bit better. As for the Shy Guys riding the Ostros, I found that stacking a Monimole on top of a Koopa did the job pretty well. The biggest problem with this stage was missing bob-omb throws. At the bottom layer, there's 4 breakable walls you have to go through, and if you mess up the throws, there's not really a way to try again unless you restart. So in the sand portion, I made an alternate route that you can take that is usually close to impossible to make in the original. The route itself is the same, except the big hole now has ground underneath it. The only bob-omb throws you really have to worry about is this wall at the end, so for anyone struggling, you can easily hold a bob-omb and damage boost through it and grab another mushroom afterwards. For the Porky pose, I went with Spinies, which I know are way slower, but I didn't really know what else I could do. 3-3 was a colossal undertaking, and I'm shocked I even fit this whole stage in one level. The reason for that is there's multiple doors, and I had to make a couple sacrifices, but it actually plays almost exactly like the originals. I had to squeeze all the horizontal segments into the first area, and the vertical ones into the second. This is mostly fine, but this room that normally has 3 doors wasn't able to fit into the correct underground theme. but amazingly, I was able to scale everything almost the same and include all the same doors. Since this room with the 3 doors were now using pipes that allowed me to use those extra doors towards areas that were more important. For the potted Shy Guys, I figured using a sideways pipe that spawns Koopas would do the trick. I've already talked about replacing Spark with the spike tops, but they have this bizarre pattern in the key room where they just kind of move around at the top sporadically, so I put them on a conveyor belt to imitate this, and the effect is similar, except one of the spike tops knocks one of them off after a while. I'm not really sure how else I could replicate this. I guess I could use tracks as well, but hey, it's close enough. Counting out the ice blocks in 4-1 was pretty straining on my eyes, but it was nothing compared to what I just made. Remaking the flurries was also pretty easy. I just used Monty moles and their patterns were similar enough. The rocket was actually pretty fun to recreate too. I simply have a bonsai bill spawn in place, and you just stand at the top and go through this pipe to reach the other half of this level. And then there's the auto bombs, which I replaced with Monty moles and Koopa Troopas. And yes, I know I already used this for the Ostros, but they both behave in very similar ways, and I don't know what else I can do. Now, there's not much to say about 4-2, but I love how derpy I made the whales look. I just used blocks for the body and tail and a donut block for the eyeball. The whales usually spurt water, and my only idea was to add a track with a buzzy beetle. 4-3's underground sections were very time consuming, and I was really conflicted on if I should use ice blocks or donut blocks for the platforms. And well, I decided to go with a bit of both. I swapped these blocks around while playtesting and just went with what was the most fun. Now, Fryguy was really stupid to make, because there is no way that I can think of where I can hit this guy while also making him split into pieces. So I decided to use Iggy, and I stacked a bomb cannon on him that spits fire. The idea is to use a spring to knock the cannon off of him, which I guess you could count as a hit, then you step on him 3 times to imitate the smaller Fryguys. If anyone comes up with something better, then let me know so I can update this boss, because what I have is probably my worst recreation out of everything I made. 5-1's level was pretty easy to complete, although I needed to figure out the boss fight. It's Birdo once again, but the one in the original only spits fire, so I figured my best option was to just use Bowser since you can't step on him, and you have to throw cannonballs to defeat him. I'm actually pretty happy with my variations of Birdo because they all have distinct difficulties, which is really nice, especially since I can put all these levels into a world as a full game. 5-2 was more of the same thing, although I needed to make some trees with Hoopster, so I used tracks without the vines. It looks stupid, but it's functional. 5-3 had Albatos with Bob-Ohms, and the only decent substitute I could use was Lekatu that throws Bob-Ohms. It's not really the same thing since the Lekatu chase you around, but it was close enough. The underground section was annoying because I didn't have space for the potted Shy Guys, so I just added a Koopa Troopa where they usually spawn. The platforms also all needed to be passed through, so I had to use donut blocks, which makes the level easier than usual. But I did include the mushroom blocks as clouds for a bit more authenticity. Claw Grip was really hard to imitate, and what I did was put Bowser Jr. in a boxed room with a big cannon. By throwing the big cannonballs, you have to hit Bowser Jr. when he's not spinning for it to count. I also added the clouds behind him to replicate the rocks that are usually sitting there. It's not perfect, but it's not bad either. 6-1 was fairly easy, up until we went underground. That's because there's a dozen pipes that you're supposed to be able to go into, but obviously we can't do that. So instead, I added 2 of the unique ones, since the main pipe looks the same as the one from the other sub-area. And yep, this looks really stupid just having some ice blocks and 2 doors in place, but blame Mario Maker 2 for limiting us on doors, not me. 6-2 was very obnoxious to make because I couldn't really use my Albatos substitute. Using the Lekatus would make this level, well, not feel like this level at all. So for this one instance, I decided to replace the Albatos with bonsai bills so you have to jump off of them just like you do in the actual game. And this actually makes 6-2 quite tricky, but I did double check that you can beat this as normal Mario just in case you lose the suit for whatever reason. For 6-3, I found a sneaky way to keep the shortcut at the beginning by using 1 layer of donut blocks and having to mash your way through. I imagine everyone is going to do this that knows about this shortcut instead of playing the level normally, but I wanted to have both options. Now 7-1 mostly functions the same, but the cloud part is unfortunately completely broken. The donut blocks make the cloud section super easy to cheese, but I really had no other option. And I couldn't really use regular clouds because that would make this even easier, but what else can you do, right? And finally, we have 7-2. Look at the size of this map. No, seriously, look at it. I want to let you know that making most of these levels took around 1 to 4 hours to complete. 7-2 took almost 8 hours. It is so stupidly complicated, and despite that, I actually managed to fit most of it in here. The main thing that I had to cut out was the last 2 boss fights, and some of the themes aren't going to be correct. So to combat that, I just made the entire thing lava themed. If you've never played 7-2 before, this level is a doozy if you don't know which doors to take, and I was only able to add 2 checkpoints, which honestly isn't enough for something this massive. Now, in order to make this happen, I was able to combine together a few rooms that were already close together, and this allowed me to save a few doors. The other small difference is that I couldn't add the pipes at the beginning for the Shy Guys due to space, but besides that, this is mostly the same level. But of course, we have the boss fights. For the bird, I just use a giant boom boom. I tried attaching cannons to him, but then I realized that the actual bird didn't have that, so I added a cannon if you wanted to beat him authentically, but let's be honest, most of you are just gonna step on him. And for Wart, I made a giant Bowser and also added a bullet bill cannon for a little more difficulty. The only way you can beat him is to use cannonballs, and you have to be careful not to get too close or you'll get trapped inside and have to retry. I will say that this fight is somewhat similar to fighting Wart, and it's also pretty cool that I'm able to add Wart's music to the fight as well. And there you have it. That was my recreation of Super Mario Bros. 2. I feel like about 80% of my levels are faithful, and the other 20% isn't at all. This is truly a bootleg version of Mario Bros. 2. And again, if you want to check it out, I have the level code in the pinned comment. If you guys think of any more ideas to make better bosses or to optimize my levels more, let me know on Twitter so I can go back and update the levels. But with all that said, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day. Stay safe out there.